We're going to start on the bottom of Lamed Gimel Amid Beis, 5 lines up from the bottom. And we're going through the Seder Hamarocha according to Abaye, something that we're a little bit familiar with from the Karbonos. And the Gemara had a long discussion before this about the Pasuk Behitivo Es Haneros Yaktirenu. And it requires that they do Hatovas Haneros in 2 stages. The first stage is 5 Neros, and the second is 2 Neros. And after they did the Hatovas Shtei Neros, and that completed the process of all 7 Neros, then and only then were they maktir the Ketores. So Ketores comes after Neros. Batovas Shtei Neros Kodemes L'Ketores. The Yoma the pasuk says, Beitivo Es Haneros Yaktirenu. So it's only after the Hatovas Haneros, then they're maktir the Ketores. Then Abai goes on, Uktores Le'evarim. And this is very interesting because we brought the Korban Tamid Shel Shachar, and we did all the avodos from Shchita till Zrika, but the Korban Tamid, which is Korban Ola, and has to be burnt on the Mizbeach, we have postponed the Haktara of the Evarim and the Tamid until after Hatovas Haneros and after the Ketores. So it's very interesting that the Ketores is going to be wedged in such a way that it delays the final avoda of, or the culmination of the Ola of the Tamid, which is Haktoras HaEvarim. Sanya, we learned in the price. So Yuktam Davar, Shenemar Bo Baboker Baboker. In the Parsha of Ketores, in Shmot Lamed, it says Baboker Baboker, Bativoes Haneros Yaktirenu. And we said the word Yaktirenu in this pasuk is a reference to Haktoras Haktoras. And the double language of Boker means Lahaktin. It should be early. And in the case of Evari Atomid, we don't find that the Torah doubles the word Baboker. Davar Shalom Nemar Bo El Boker Echad Bilvad. And in the previous parak in Shmot Chavtes, Yasakeves Achad Taaseh Boker. That's a reference to the Talmud Shel Boker. And the Torah only uses the word Boker once. And therefore, the Ketores comes before the Evarim of the Talmud, because in the case of the Ketores, it says Boker twice. Now we're ready for the next stage, because every Korban Ola, and certainly the Talmud, has to be accompanied by what we call a mincha. And the mincha is made up of soles and shemen and yayin. And it makes sense that immediately after we finish the haktara of the Evarim of the Talmud, we're now ready for the accompanying mincha. Yisanya, we learned in the Brisa, minayin shelo yeh davar kodem l'tamid shel shachar. In other words, you could have argued that maybe this is a weak Havamina, but nevertheless a Havamina. Maybe the Korban Mincha should be brought simultaneous with the Olas Tamid, or maybe even before the Olas Tamid, or at least before the Haktaras HaEvarim of the Korban. But that we can't do because the Tamid Shel Shachar has to be first. And it's only after we finish the Korban Tamid Shel Shachar, then we can bring the Mincha. Because again, the Mincha, at least the Solas part, we're not so sure about the Yayin, but the Mincha itself has to be brought on the Mizbeach, but we can't bring anything on the Mizbeach until we finally bring the Tamid. The Tamid has to be first. And the completion of the Tamid is with the Haktaras HaEvarim. So here we'll turn to Daf Lamed Daled and Talmud Lomar, from whence do we derive that the Ola Saboker, meaning the Tamid Shel Shach has to be the first carbon of the day. Nothing else goes on Mizbeach until after the Tamid. And it says in the Pasuk, Vayikra Perek Vav, Ubier Oleh HaKohen Eitzim Baboker V'Arach Oleha HaOla. Now notice the extra hey in the word HaOla. Amar Rava, HaOla, Hi Ola Rishona. It should be the first carbon on the Maracha, on the Mizbeach. We should not be makar anything before the Tamid, because everything has to be orach oleha. Oleha means on it or after it, and the ola is first, and this ola is ha-ola. The ha-ola, the he'ayidiyah, is the ola satamid. And in a sense, if you look in the Torah, you'll see that in Parshas Pinchas, the first carbon ola that's mentioned in the entire list over there in Bamidbar Perek Chavches is the ola satamid. So the ha-ola is a reference to the most chashuv ola, which is the carbon tamid, and then everything else that comes on the mizbeach has to come after the ola satamid. Now Abai says mincha lechavitin. We're ready to bring the mincha that accompanies the carbon tamid, and then afterwards we're ready for the Kohen Gadol's mincha, which he brought twice a day, once a day, and then split it into half, and that's called the minchas chavitin. And the pasuk says in Vayikra, of all places in Parshas Emor, Perek Chav Gimel, it says Lahakar Vishel Hashem Ola umincha, which means that the Ola and the mincha should be contiguous. Ola umincha. It's like a package deal. The Ola and its mincha. And that means that the mincha should be brought immediately after the Hakravas HaOla, and we should not delay by wedging the chavitin in between. Now, there's a discussion here in the Achronim, which I don't want to get into now, about why was there a havamina that the minchas chavitim should come before the minchas hatamin. But in any event, it's clear from the pasuk that the ola comes right. The mincha comes right after the ola, and that's clear from the pasuk that says ola u mincha. Ola first, and immediately afterwards mincha. No room for wedging in the chavitin. Okay, why does the chavitin come next? That doesn't make any sense intuitively, because what accompanies the tamid is not just the soles, but also the nesachim. So why is it that in Abaye's Seder HaMaracha, he's got the chavitin before the nesachim? He says chavitim the nesachim meaning referring to yayin. And the reason for that is the Torah went out of its way to categorize, to describe the chavitim as a mincha. That's called shum mincha, shem mincha. And in Vayikra Perek Vav, it says asirisai fasolas leminchat minchat amid. And the Torah is describing the chavitim as a mincha. And now we go back to the previous pasuk that says Ola u mincha, and what we're going to do is we're going to upgrade the chavitim to the status of a mincha, such that it comes immediately after the Ola, even before the nisachim. Now, what about Shabbos? Well, what about Shabbos? Well, on Shabbos we have a carbon musaf, and the question is, when should we bring the carbon musaf? And in the parsha of Karban Musaf, you get the impression that Musaf should come earlier than later. So how do we know that the Nesachim of Yayin, of the Karban Tamid, should come before the Musafim? And that's derived from the Pasuk. And again in Parshas Emor it says, L'akriv Yishel Hashem Ola umincha. That's the Pasuk we saw before. Zevach unesachim. So the zevach is a reference here to your classic zevach, which is every day of the year, 365 days out of the year, and that's the carbon tamid. So immediately after the zevach comes the nesachim. We're not going to break up the continuity between the carbon tamid and then Nisachim by wedging the Musafim in. Musafim is a new independent carbon, a mitzvah of bringing the Saf. And perhaps what the Gemara has in mind here is that what generates the carbon musaf is the Kedusha Sayom. That has nothing to do with the carbon tamid. The Zevach Unisachim is generated by the Yom itself every day, which without it being endowed with Kedusha Sayom. So first we'll do the Zevach, then the Nisachim. Now we're ready for the emergence of a new profile of a carbon, and that's the Kedusha Sayom of Shabbos, which engenders a Chi of carbon musaf. But now, if we're already on Shabbos, we have a serious issue. And this is a sugya in Perek Tamid Nishchat in Psachim. Because there are two different avodos that are special, unique to Shabbos. One is the Musaf, and the other is the Lechem Haponim, which was placed on the Shulchan one Shabbos and then removed next Shabbos to be replaced by the new batch of 12 Lechamim. And the Lechem Haponim has to be accompanied by what's called Levona. The Levona is brought in spoons, which are called bezichen, and the bezichen and levona are placed right next to the lechem hapanim. The lechem hapanim was divided up into 6 and 6 on two sides of the shulchan vertical, and on each side of the 6 there was one of the bezichen full of levona. Levona is one of the spices that's used in the Ketores. I think in English it's called frankincense, which don't even ask me what it looks like, but I was told that I should get a hold of it. It might help restore my smell. But anyway, so now comes the big machlokas here between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, which is the subject of the sugya in Tamid Nishchat. What comes first? We have a pressing need of an obligation to be fulfilled that's generated by Kedusha Shabbos called Musaf. We have another obligation that's generated by Kedusha Sayom of Shabbos in the context of the Lechem HaPanim, and that's called Shnei Bazichim of Levona. Which comes first, the Musafim or the Bazichim? Rabbi Shmuel is of the opinion that Musafim come first, and Rabbi Akiva that Bazichim. Abaye says that Nisachim come before the Musafim, and that we derive from Zevach Nisachim. So the Musaf is now being delayed, but Musafim Kodmim Lebazichim. Immediately after we finish up with the carbon tamid, and we brought the Eivarim on the Mizbeach, and we brought the Mincha Soles, and we brought the Yayin Linisachim. Now we're ready for the carbon musaf. Do not delay the carbon musaf, says Abaye, until after the Shnei Bazichim. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, Vatani, we have a brisa that says just the opposite, the Bazichim Kol Musafim Tanoi. No, it's that brisa that says Bazichim Kol Musafim, that's Rabbi Akiva. Abaye was accepting the Shita Rabbi Shmuel, and according to Rabbi Shmuel, Musaf comes before Bazichim. And the Gemara over there in Masechet Psachim on Daf Nun Ches has a whole analysis of this machlokes, which comes first, Bazichim or Musafim. Amar Abaye says, when I look at the Torah, I seem to have a very strong proof that Musaf should come first, meaning that when Abaye codified his Seder HaMarachim and he placed Musaf before Bazichim, it's based on the logic that he's about to present. Again, when I use the word logic, please don't misunderstand me. I have no clue in the world about anything that we're learning. Why the Seder is exactly like that. Why the Bazichim should come after the Musaf and vice versa, I don't know. It's all a matter of psukim.
Right.
And maybe when we get to meet the man with the big G on the sweatshirt, maybe he'll give us a little bit of philosophical explanation about the Seder.
Right.
But in the meantime, Abai says, let's look at the psukim. And I'm going to prove to you that Musaf comes first. Lav mi amri, doesn't the pasuk say baboker baboker? And we always assume, remember we had a discussion, which comes first, the Ketores or the Avarim of the Karbonola? And we said the Ketores comes first because it says baboker baboker. So we see that the language of baboker baboker indicates kedima, that it should come first in sequence. Hachanami here too, if we open up to the Parsha Bazicha, we're going to find the exact opposite. The double language boker means kedima, that it has to come early. Then we have another word, which is called bayom. And the word bayom means anywhere during the course of the day, no urgency. We can delay it. And with regard to the Bazichin, the Torah says bayom, bayom, to tell me not makdimim, but ma'achrim. And this is a pasuk in Parshas Emor. It says bayom, bayom, b'yom HaShabbos yarichena. And that pasuk is a reference to the Bazichin, to the Aricha of the Shulchan, with the Shtei Lechem, with the Lechem Aponim, and with the Bazichin. And it says Bayom, Bayom twice. In Musaf, it only says the word Bayom once. And since we said that the word Bayom indicates delaying it, it's the exact flipped opposite of Baboker, therefore the Torah is telling you that Musaf is not early in the day, but yet it's early in the day, relative to wherever it says Bayom, Bayom, which is later in the day, and that's going to be Bazichin. So Abaye is quoting a pasuk to support the Shita of Rabbi Shmuel that Musafim Kodmin LeBazichin. Now the Gemara says, but let's be fair. And how do we defend Rabbi Akiva? My time in demand Yoma Bazichin Kodmin LeMusafim. Gomar Chuka Chuka Michavitim. You know, as we said that Chavitim come before Musafim, and the Chavitim, in fact, come before the Nesachim, and how much more so before Musafim, right? Because Musaf, as we said, is a new parsha. Nesachim is still part of the Talmud, and yet the Chavitim came before the Nesachim because it was called a Mincha, if you remember. And now we have the word Chukah not only in the parsha of Chavitim, Vayikra Perek Vav, it says Chak Olam Lashem, but also the parsha Bazichim, it says in Perek Chav Dalet of Vayikra, meaning in Parshas Emor, it says Kodesh Kadoshim Hu, which means that it has to be burnt on the Mizbeach. That's the Levona. And then it says Chak Olam, exactly the same two words, Chak Olam, that appear in the parsha of Chavitim. And the Chavitim come before the Nesachim, which by definition means they come before the Musafim. So the Torah is now telling us that we should have an equation between the Bazichim and the Chavitim. Just like the Chavitim come before the Nesachim, and therefore ipso facto before the Musafim, so too, by virtue of this Gzeir Shabbat Chok Olam, the Bazichim should come before the Musafim. And once again, if you ask me for some logical explanation, I got to throw up my hands. It's all a question of how to darshan. The Gemara now has a problem with Rabbi Akiva's Gzeir Shalom. Ime Hasam Gomar. If you're telling me that the source for the Bazichim, that it comes before the Musafim, is the Chavitim, then Ligmei Kulin Milsav. Let's learn all the dinim of Bazichim from Chavitim. You know, we have a principle called Ein Hekesh L'Mechza, Ein Gzeir Shava L'Mechza. So we should be consistent with this Gzeir Shava, equating the Bazichim with the Chavitim. And we should say the following: just like in Chavitim, the Chavitim come before the Musafim, and that was derived from the fact that the Chavitim are called Mincha. So just like the Mincha comes before the Nesachim, so too the Chavitim come before the Nesachim. And by virtue of the analogy to Gzeir Shava, Bazichin should come before the Nesachim. You're telling me that the Bazichin are going to come before Musaf. Why not go one step further up the line, and say that the Bazichin should come before the Nesachim? Now, again, if you ask me logically, it makes no sense whatsoever. The Bazichin is part of the Kedusha Shabbos of the Lechem Aponim. Why should that come wedged in between the Korban Mincha of the Tamid and the Nesachim of the Tamid? But nevertheless, if you have Gzeira Shava and the entire enterprise of Seder Hamarach is all based on Gzeira Sakasu, so then in the context of this Gzeira Shava, we should take the Bazichin and upgrade them, so to speak, to before the Nesachim, just like we did it with the Chavitim. So Chavitim equals Bazichin, Bazichin equals Chavitim, and they should all be before the Nesachim. Where answers love, so we are sort of balancing between two contradictory Yalfusas. We have one Yalfusa of the Gzeira Shava of Chok Olam, which would tell me if I base myself solely on this Gzeira Shava, I can conclude that the Bazichin should come even before the Nesachim. But on the other hand, if you remember, the Torah in the Parsha of Bazichin says Bayom HaShabbos, Bayom HaShabbos, and the word Bayom indicates li'acher, to delay it. And the Torah doubles up the delay. So what is the meaning of this doubling up the delay? It's telling you that although we derive from Chavitim that we should be makdim the Bazichin to the Musafim, but nevertheless, from the fact that it says Bayom in the Parsha of Bazichin, we're going to say that the Bazichin come after the Nesachim. Okay. This was the easy part of Daf Lamed. Now we get to the real challenge. Now, the sugya that we're about to embark upon is based on the first parak of Yoma, and it appears also here in the third parak of Daf Lamed Gimel, the machlokas between Chachamim and Abba Shaul. So I made myself a little bit of a chart here to help me navigate through this. I don't have a whiteboard here, but it works like this. I would start with the sheet of the Chachamim simply because it's a lot easier. The Chachamim will place, let me say it this way. I think this is, in my humble opinion, the easiest way of saying it. When we talk about the Korban Tamid, the avod of which begins with Shrita and ends with Zrikas Hadam, what we're anticipating now is the Hakrovas Ha'imurim, the Aktorah of a Korban Tamid. As we said many times, Korban Tamid is a Korban Olah, and it's going to be burnt on the Mizbeh. What comes between the Zrikas Hadam, which completes the Avodas Hadam, and the Hakrovas Ha'ivor? The Chachamim are of the opinion, the Rabbanan, that we have two different, we'll call them avodos, that are wedged in between the dam and the ivar. And those two are Ktores and Neros. Neros meaning Hatovas HaNeros. And how are we going to set up the Neros and Ktores? What we're going to do is we're going to kick off the process of Hatovas HaNeros immediately after the Zrikas Hadam Atomid. That's called Hatovas Chamesh Neros. And then we're going to be makted the Ktores. So we're going to sort of freeze the process of Haktoras Haktores, and this is the previous sugya Daf Lamed Gimel, in order to inject the Ktores in the middle of Hatovas HaNeros. So in a certain sense, we begin the Hatavas Haneros before the Ketores, but we don't conclude the Hatavas Haneros before the Ketores. We're going to do only Hatava 5 Neros, and we're going to derive some psukim. How do we get to number 5? That was on Daf Lamed Gimel. And then before we get to the final concluding Hatava of 2 Neros, we're going to be mocked to the Ketores. So what we have is Dam, right, Zrikas Adam, then Hatovas Chamesh Neros, then Haktoras Haktoras, then Hatovas Shtei Neros, and finally Hakrovas Eivon. Abishol says, no. We're going to begin the whole process with the Neros. We're going to start with Hatovas Chamesh Neros. Then we'll do the Zrikas Adam. Again, all this is counterintuitive, but that's Abishol. After the Zrikas Adam, we complete the process of Hatovas Haneros with Hatovas Shtei Neros. Then we're marked to the Ketores. So according to Abishol, Haktoras is after Neros, completely after Neros. Not like the Tanakama, the Rabbanon, who will place Haktoras in the middle of the Hatovas Haneros, meaning before the Hatovas Shtei Neros. Not so according to Abishol. We're finishing with the Hatovas Haneros. Again, we did wedge something in the middle of Hatovas Haneros, but not the Ketores. It was the Zrikas Dam Hatovim. And then after we finish the process of Neros and then Ketores, then says Abishol, we're ready for the Ketores Haivor. So that what's common to both the Rabbanon and Abishol is that we're pushing off Hakrovas Haivarim until after Neros and Ketores. The Machlokes is where to place the Zrikas Adam of the Talmud, and not only that, which comes first, Neros or Ketores, whereas Abishol has Ketores at the very end, after he's already completed the process of Hatovas Haneros. The Rabbanon have the Ketores wedged in the middle of the Hatovas Haneros before the Hatovas Shtei Neros. But both Abishol and Tanakama agree that we've got to place Neros and Ketores in between Zrikas Adam and Hakrovas Haivarim. And now what we're going to do in our sugya is we're going to read our Mishnah meticulously, and we're going to try to figure out whether the Mishnah reflects one or the other of these 2 shittas of the Rabbanan or of Abishol. And strangely enough, the Gemara is going to come to the conclusion that our Mishnah doesn't reflect neither the Rabbanan nor Abishol. Because the language of the Mishnah is Ketores Shel Shachar, Haisa Kreva Ben Dam Le'evarim. Now this is strange. I admit that the Ketores is going to be wedged between the Zrikas Adam and Hakrovas Haivarim, but the Mishnah completely omits any mention of Neros. And the machlokes between the Rabbanan and Abishol revolves around how to juggle Neros and Ketores between Dam and Eivar. The Mishnah only mentions Ketores, just completely ignores the Dam, the Neros. Mani, to whom can we attribute the authorship of our Mishnah? That with regard to the Avod of Shachar, or the Talmud Shel Shachar, we're going to do the Ketores between Zrika and Hakrovas Haivarim. Rabbanon, if you go according to the Chachamim Shita, then the Seder Avodas HaShachar requires Zrikas Adam, Hatovas Chamesh Neros, then the Ketores, then Hatovas Shtei Neros, and then Haivarim. So the Mishnah omitted any mention of the Neros. And therefore, the Gemara says, "Mibayale," what it should have said in the Mishnah is "Bein Dam Lineros," meaning that there should be a Ketores that comes between Dam and Neros, right? Because according to the Chachamim Shiti, you have Haktaras before Hatava Shtei Neros. And all that's mentioned in that Mishnah is the Haktaras before the Avarim. Well, what about the Neros? So now you're going to tell me, okay, by process of elimination, who's the author of that Mishnah? Abba Shaul. That's not good news either. Why? Because if we're going to assume that that Mishnah reflects the cheat of Abba Shaul, then according to Abba Shaul, the Seder of the Avoda of the Talmid Shel Shachar is Hatavas Chamesh Neros, meaning Abba Shaul has this very unique shita that we start with Neros even before we get to the Talmud. Again, these are the Neros of the morning. And then after we do the Neros and Zrikas Hadam, we start with our Tovah Shtei Neros, then we go to the Ketores, and then we finish up with Hakravas Eivarim. So therefore, the language of the Mishnah once again is very difficult. It should have said in the Mishnah, Bein Neros le'Eivarim miboile. The Ketores should come, according to Abba Shaul, between the Neros and the Eivarim. Meaning we finish up the process of Neros, we completed Hatavas HaNeros, then we're ready for Haktaras HaKtores, and now we're ready for Hakravas Eimurim. Just the bottom line of this whole Kasha of the Gemara is that Bein LeChachamim and Bein LeAbba Shaul, we are going to integrate in between the Zrikas Hadam and Hakravas HaEvarim, not only Ketores, but also Neros. And within that, we have an inner machlokas, a more specified machlokas between the Rabbanon and Abba Shaul, whereas the Rabbanon have Haktaras before the end of Hatavas, before the Shtei Neros, and Abba Shaul puts Haktaras at the end, after we finish the entire process of Hatavas HaNeros. But our Mishnah makes no mention of Hatavas HaNeros. If the Mishnah is going through the Seder of Talmid Shel Shachar, how could it possibly omit mention of the Neros? So the Gemara says, Li'olam Rabbanan, and the Mefarshim say that we have a principle of Yochid v'Rabim. In other words, if we have a Mishnah and we have two options, we would always opt for the Rabbanan, for the majority view. But basically, what we'll see is that our Mishnah has nothing to do with the Machlokes Rabbanan and Abba Shaul. Why? Because Bisidra, meaning Seder Avoda, Lo Kamairi, the Mishnah is not addressing the Seder Avoda. That's not the theme. That's not the subject of this Mishnah. And even though it's true that according to Chachamim, the Ketores is going to be wedged between the Dama and the Neros, and according to Abba Shaul, the Neros will be wedged between the Dam and the Hakravas Eivarim, but there's no mention of Neros. Why? Because the subject of this Mishnah is not Seder, but rather Ketores. The theme or the title page of this Mishnah is Ketores. Where is the Ketores in relation to the Talmud? And the answer is that the Ketores is wedged in between the Dam, the Avodas Dam, which terminates with Zrika, and Haktaras HaEvarim. What the exact Seder is, A, B, C, D, where Neros come in, and whether the Ketores splits between the 5 and the 2 Hatavas HaNeros, or whether or not the Ketores comes after the Hatava of all 7 Neros. All that is irrelevant to the Mishnah. This Mishnah is not interested in the Seder HaMaroch. Now the Gemara says the following. It says in our Mishnah about the Ketores shel bein arbayim ha'sakreva bein eivarim l'nisachim. So that you and I would have said, well, we finished the Eivarim, now we're ready for the Nesachim. And the Mishnah, to our surprise, tells us no, that we're going to bring the Ketores before the Nesachim. We're going to delay the Nesachim for the benefit of the Ketores. Again, we're talking about the Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim, not the Talmud Shel Shach. So the Ketores comes before the Minchas HaNesachim. Now let's just mention in passing that the Minchas Nesachim is Asiris Ha'efa Solis, and that's accompanying the Talmud. And we're going to delay the Minchas Nesachim with regard to the Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim until after the Ketores. Inani Mili. How do we know that there's a distinction, a contrast between the Ketores of Bein Harbayim, where the Ketores comes before the Nesachim, and the Ketores of Shachar, where the Ketores comes before the Eivarim? So in the case of Bein Harbayim, this is what we have to hakarayin and kah. We are going to start with the Eivarim and then get to Ketores. Again, it will be before the Nesachim, but it'll be after the Eivarim. Whereas in Shachris, we are makdim the Ketores to the Eivarim. And in Bein Harbayim, we're makdim the Eivarim to the Ketores. On Rabbi Yochanan, we derive this from a drasha, the Amakra. The pasuk says at the end of Parashas Pinchas, "V'eis hakeves hasheni taseh bein harbayim, kiminchas haboker ucheniskot taseh." Now the emphasis here is on the chaf hadimyon. It says kim minchas haboker. Now this seems to indicate that there's some sort of equation between the mincha of Bein Harbayim and the mincha of Boker. That the mincha of Bein Harbayim should be equal to and resemble the minchas haboker. And Rabbi Yochanan now interprets this. Ma minchas haboker ores kodemes l'nesachim. That's what we learned earlier, that in the Seder Avoda we start with the Ketores, and then we do the Eivarim, and then the Mincha, then we have the Chavitim, and then finally the Nesachim. So certainly the Ketores is very early, way, way, way before the Nesachim. And therefore, Afkad, in Minchas Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim, it's also going to be Ketores Kodemes l'Nesachim. Yeah, but wait a minute. We're not at home plate yet. We're not in the clear. Because if you accept the chaf hadimyon, we just finished saying in our Mishnah that there's a difference between the Ketores of the morning and the Ketores of Bein Harbayim. And in Shachris, we said that the Ketores comes before the Eivarim, but in Bein Harbayim, we said the Eivarim comes before the Ketores. So how are you going to support and sustain this chaf hadimyon of Rabbi? That's the Gemara's immediate objection. If the Seder Avodah of the Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim is derived from an equation to the Avodah of Talmud Shel Shachar, then we should accept that equation from A to Z. Malahalan, just like in the Talmud Shel Shachar, is Ketores Kodemes le'Eivarim. Why do you say in the Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim it's the opposite? And you switch around the order and you have the Eivarim before the Ketores. We should have said Malahalan Ketores Kodemes le'Eivarim. And that's from the fact that it says Baboker, teaching you that the Ketores comes before the Eivarim. And that was the first thing we learned, what we started today on Daf Lamed Gimel Amid Beis. Afkan, so the Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim, by virtue of the equation of the Chaf hadimyon, is Ktores Kodemis Leivar? The Gemara answers, Miksiv, does it say in the Apostle? Yes, Hakeves Hashenita Sebein Arbayim, Ke'evrei HaBoker, which means that you should do the Aktorah of the Evrei Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim like you do the Aktorah of the Evrei Boker, which means that just like in the morning you bring the Eivarim of the Talmud after the Torah, so too by Erev you should bring the Eivarim after the Ketores. This is an impossible, untenable position. Why? Because it doesn't say Ke'evrei HaBoker in the Pasuk, but rather it says Ke'minchas HaBoker. And the Pasuk is telling us that the mincha of the Erev should be like the mincha of the Boker. Not that the Eivarim of the Erev should be Ke'evrei HaBoker. V'lo Ke'evrei HaBoker. So the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim was equated with the Talmud Shel Shachar only with regard to the Minchas Nesach. There was no equation between the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim and Talmud Shel Shachar with regard to the Eivarim. And therefore, with regard to the Ketores of Ben Arbayim, the Eivarim are going to come first. Although the Ketores will come before the Minchas HaNesachim, that we learn from the Chaf HaDinyon, because it says in the Pasuk, Ke'minchas HaBoker, but it doesn't say Ke'evrei HaBoker. So despite the fact that with regard to the Talmud Shel Shachar, the Ketores comes before the Eivarim, nevertheless, with regard to the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim, the Eivarim comes before the Ketores. And the Ketores will only come before the Minchas Nisachim. So here we are on the Brisa at the bottom of Daf Lamed Daled Amud Aleph. The Gemara had introduced the drasha from Parshas Pinchas of Geminchas HaBoker, which means that we have an equation between the avoda of the Talmud Shel Shachar and the avoda of the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim. But which is the Melamed and which is the Nilmad? Where do we start and where do we end? And on this, we're going to have a machlokas. So the Gemara now quotes a brisa, and the brisa is going to darshan the pasuk, which comes right before this pasuk of Keminchas HaBoker, with regard to the Nisuch HaYayin, that's the Nesachim that accompany the Talmud. And here we're going to have machlokas shin Rebbe and the Chacham. What is that pasuk referring to? Is it referring to the Talmud Shel Shachar? And then we're going to derive by analogy the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim, or is the pasuk referring to the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim, and then we're going to have to derive the Talmud Shel Shachar from the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim. Now, in the parsha of Talmud Tanur Rabbanan, it says V'nisko Revi'is Hahid, that the Nesachim, again, this is the pasuk right before, immediately before Keminchas HaBoker, and the Nesachim have to be made up of Revi'is Hahid, La Keves HaChad, meaning that the Keves, which is the carbon Talmud, requires Nisuch HaYayin, and that's got to be the volume of a Revi'is Hahid. But it's not clear what this pasuk is referring to. Are we talking about the Talmud Shel Shachar or the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim? The Torah is completely oblivious about that. So the Chachamim say that when it says here in this pasuk, La Keves HaEchad, it's referring to Ben Arbayim. Very strange. Why should we say HaKeves HaEchad is referring to the Ben Arbayim? I would have said HaEchad is referring to the Boker. But the answer is because earlier in the parsha begins in Pasuk Daled, and it says, "Hakeves HaEchad taseh b'boker, hakeves hasheni taseh ben arbayim." So the last keves, the last carbon Talmud that's mentioned, is ben arbayim. So therefore, the following psukim should be referring to the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim. We therefore don't have a pasuk with regard to Talmud Shel Shachar that mentions bringing the sachim. Therefore, the conclusion, according to Chachamim, is that Yilmad shel Shachris mishal Arvis. That just like the Talmud shel Arvis requires Nisa Hayayim, so too the Talmud shel Shachar requires Nisa Hayayim. And here we'll turn to Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis. But Rebbe disagrees. Rebbe Omer that Hakeves Hachad, the extra Ha-Echad in the Pasuk, indicates that we're talking about the Talmud shel Shachar. So we only have a source for Havas Nisachim with regard to that Talmud shel Shachar. And therefore, the Melamed is Shachar, and the Nilmad is Arvis, Mishal Shachar is. So the Gemara says, Bishlema Lirabanan. We can understand, according to the Chachamim Shita, that we're going to derive the Talmud shel Shachar from the Talmud shel Bein Ha'arbayim. That I understand very well, because the pasuk says immediately before this, Ve'esakeves Hasheni Taseh Bein Ha'arbayim, referring clearly to the Talmud shel Bein Ha'arbayim. Is high the Talmud shel Ha'arbayim Ksiv El Rebbe my time? And the answer is Amar Rabba Bar Ula Amar Kra Lakeves Ha'echad. This very pasuk Zayin, that we're trying to figure out, because it's so ambiguous. It's like stem cells, it's not determined. It says like keves ha'echad. Amar kra like keves ha'echad ezu kevet shenemer bo echad. Let's look in this context of the two tmidim, if one of them is described as keves ha'echad. Heavy Yomi said Talmud shel Shachar. The pasuk says es keves ha'echad tasema boker. So Keves Achad must be referring to the Talmud shel Boker. So now the Gemara is going to turn the tables on the Rabbanon. According to the Rabbanon, my Echad. Why does the Torah say Keves Achad, and the Rabbanon say that it's referring to the last Keves that was mentioned in the previous psukim, a few psukim earlier, namely the Keves, the Talmud shel Bein Ha'arbayim, but it says Ha'echad. And Keves Ha'echad is clearly a reference to the Talmud shel Shachar. So what the Rabbanan do now is they pull a fast one on us. They're going to take the word Ke'echad totally out of context. And it's going to be used as a universal principle, a breakthrough in the laws of Karbanos. Has nothing to do with the Talmud per se. We're going to lift it with a crane and put it down elsewhere.
Right.
It means that when you bring a carbon, this reminds me of Hevel and Cain, you should bring it from the Mufchar, Ha'echad, the best in your entire flock, whether it's sheep, whether it's rams, whether it's goats, whatever it is, bring the best. For Rebbe, how does Rebbe derive this fantastic halacha that you should always be bringing the miyuchad shebe'edro? And he sends us to an entirely different parsha. If I'm not mistaken, this is a Parshas Re'eh. And there the pasuk says, "Ve'hayaha makom." I read the whole pasuk; it doesn't appear in the text. Asher yivchar Hashem Elokeichem bo l'chakein shmo sham, shama taviu eis kol asher anochi mitzaves chem olosechem v'zivchem kasosechem shumas yedchem v'chol mivchar midrechem. After that's where we're going to derive it from. Mivchar midrechem. Now it's very interesting because the pasuk that the Rabbanan build on, which is ha'echad, keves ha'echad, that's referring to a korban chova. The pasuk in Parshas Re'eh is referring to a korban nedava. It says mivchar midrechem. So the Gemara asks Rabbanan, why did the Rabbanan need the pasuk ha'echad, keves ha'echad, to teach you mivchar? Why not derive it from this pasuk mivchar midrechem? It's pretty explicit. The Gemara answers chad bechova v'chad din nedava utzrichi. The Rabbanan are of the opinion that this requirement of mivchar, of miyuchad shebe'edro, has to be taught in both karban yachid and karban nidava, meaning chovas yachid and nidava. And Rashi explains the tzrichus of why we need both. He says that if you have a carbon chova, you certainly want to fulfill your obligation in the best possible way. And therefore, you're going to take min hamuvchar, the best of the best. But if it's only a nedava, maybe you could get away with something better than the best. After all, the whole enterprise is purely voluntary. On the other hand, logic would dictate that dafka in the case of a nedava, he should bring from the miyuchad. Why? Because he's motivated and he takes the initiative l'rotzon al mizbechi, to bring about the rotzon of Hashem by offering a carbon nedava, voluntary carbon. He's going to bring it from the best of the best. If it's a carbon chova, then we'll be yotzei with whatever we have. We don't have to look for the best of the best. And Rashi compares it to giving a gift to a friend, and it's purely voluntary in order to cement a friendship. So for sure, you want to be the yapa of the gift, the doro, and give him the best that you possibly can, so that he'll receive it l'rotzon.